He, Knight of Fire, had always known the sea as a friend, a blue horizon that promised fish, trade, and stories carried by the wind. On the day her world ended, the sea turned into an enemy, bringing with it not blessings but shadows. She was 17, still young enough to dream, yet old enough to carry the burdens of her village when the men came from across the water. They arrived not with greetings, but with fire, iron, and laughter that felt more like the growls of wolves than the joy of men. The smoke rose before the screams. Aen's mother had been kneading bread when the first horn echoed across the shore, a sound unfamiliar yet terrifying in its strength. By the time Anne rushed outside, flames already licked the thatched roofs of nearby huts. She saw warriors with strange round shields, axes glinting in the twilight, and eyes that carried no pity. Their words were foreign, harsh, and sharp, like stones struck together. Though Aen did not understand, she knew enough. These were not visitors. These were destroyers. Her father shouted for her to run toward the trees, but she froze. It was not only fear that rooted her, but the sight of her younger brother clinging to their mother's skirts. Aen could not move while they stood in danger. And then, before her eyes, chaos consumed the world she had always known. The warriors stormed through, cutting down those who resisted, binding those who did not. She watched her father fall. His defiance answered with a brutal strike. Her mother screamed, pulling her brother close. Strong arms seized them. Aen herself was grabbed from behind, her wrists bound tightly with rope that cut into her skin. She struggled, kicked, cried out, but the man holding her only laughed, dragging her toward the shore. The salt spray hit her face, the scent of sea and smoke blending into a memory that would never leave her. Her village, her family, her childhood, a low of it burned behind her as she stumbled toward a longship that loomed like a beast waiting to swallow her whole. The ship was unlike anything she had ever seen. Its carved prow rose high, shaped like a dragon, as though it were alive. Men poured onto it, pulling captives aboard, their cries drowned by the clash of weapons and the roar of fire. Aen's tears blurred her vision, but her mind burned each moment into memory. The trembling of the earth beneath rushing feet, the acrid smoke that clawed her throat, the sound of chains rattling like a funeral dirge. On the deck, she was thrown among others' neighbors, cousins, children, all bound and broken. She saw eyes wide with terror, cheeks streaked with ash. Some prayed, others stared blankly, already lost to despair. Aen's heart hammered in her chest, but even in that storm of fear, something within her refused to break. She whispered to the girl beside her, a child no older than 10, "Hold on. Do not give up. We are still alive." The child nodded weakly, clinging to those words as though they were a rope keeping her from drowning. In that moment, Aen discovered a truth. Though she could not stop the chains, though she could not fight the warriors, she still had power. She had her voice, her courage, her refusal to surrender her spirit. As the longship pushed away from the shore, Aen looked back one last time. The village that had been her world was now only smoke against the darkening sky. She closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in promise. She vowed that no matter what awaited her across the sea, she would not let her soul be enslaved. They could bind her wrists, they could burn her home, but they could not take the fire inside her. The night stretched on, filled with the sounds of waves crashing against the hull and the distant cries of those still grieving. Aen lay on the wooden deck, her body aching, her heart raw. Yet even there, with nothing left, she whispered softly to herself, "I will endure." The words became a shield, invisible yet strong, protecting her from the darkness closing in. The raven that flew above the ship that night might have been just a bird to the warriors, but to Aen it was a sign. A dark figure against the moonlit sky, it circled once and vanished into the horizon. She felt it was a messenger, a reminder that stories did not end in fire, they began there. Hers was only beginning. Chains across the sea had always been Aen's friend when she stood on the shore of her homeland. But now, bound on the deck of the dragon-prowed longship, it became a prison wall, stretching endlessly in every direction. The salty wind that once felt like freedom now whipped across her face as a cruel reminder that escape was impossible. Around her, dozens of captives lay bound, some sobbing quietly, others too stunned to speak. The Vikings moved among them, laughing, dividing their attention between steering the vessel and ensuring no captive tried to resist. Their voices were sharp and loud, full of authority, and though Aine could not understand their language, she could hear in their tone the certainty of men who felt invincible. The longship cut through the water with terrifying speed. Aine had never seen anything so swift and silent, moving like a predator across the waves. The shallow bottom of the vessel allowed it to skim across waters both deep and shallow. And when she realized that this was the very thing that had doomed her village, this engineering marvel that allowed men from across the sea to strike, where no warning could reach her, stomach twisted. These ships were not just transport. They were weapons of conquest. But even as despair tried to suffocate her, Anne held on to one thing. She still had her spirit. She turned her head to the side, whispering words of comfort to the child lying next to her, the same girl she had tried to protect when they were first dragged aboard. The girl's name, she learned, was Bridget. Her parents had been taken, or slain, and did not ask which, for she already knew the truth from the hollow look in Bridget's eyes. Instead, she pressed her shoulder against the girl's in quiet solidarity. "We will endure," she murmured. "No matter what happens, we must live." Aine noticed how her words, spoken in soft Irish, caught the attention of the captives near her. They could not move freely, but they leaned toward her, listening. Her voice, steady though her body shook, became a thread-weaving hope through the broken company. She did not know it yet, but that was how resilience often worked. It began not with grand gestures, but with a whisper. With one person choosing to believe that despair was not the only path, the nights and days blurred into one another as the longship pressed on. Driven by the steady rhythm of the oars and the unyielding sails, sometimes storms threatened, lightning tearing the sky and waves crashing over the deck. The Vikings shouted commands, their movements coordinated, their strength terrifying to behold. Aine clung to the wood, praying the ship would not capsize. Yet each time, the longship endured, proving its design was as relentless as the men who built it. The captives suffered during these days, for the Vikings spared little thought for their comfort. They were fed scraps, water given only enough to keep them alive, the ropes cut into their wrists, and the stench of fear, sweat, and seawater hung heavy. Yet within this misery, Aine found purpose. When Bridget cried in the night, Aine whispered stories of their homeland, the green hills, the songs sung at festivals, the laughter of children running in the fields. Others listened, silent at first, then slowly allowing themselves to remember. In remembering, they found strength. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the sea with crimson light, Aine lifted her eyes to the horizon. She thought of her father's last command, the one she had disobeyed: run. She had not run. But now she realized perhaps survival did not mean running, it meant enduring long enough to see another dawn, to carry forward what was stolen. Her body might be bound, but her will could still run free. Carrying the memory of her people like a torch that no Viking could extinguish, it was then that one of the Vikings, a man with a scar across his cheek, paused near her. He seemed to notice how the other captives gathered their strength around Aine's quiet presence. He crouched low, staring at her with piercing blue eyes. His words were foreign, but his tone was questioning, almost curious. She met his gaze without flinching, though her heart pounded. For a long moment they held each other's stare, two worlds colliding without understanding. Then he stood and walked away, shaking his head as though unsettled. Aine realized something profound. Even her captors could not fully ignore the strength of spirit. Perhaps they thought they owned her body, but they had no chain strong enough for her soul. The voyage dragged on, and the endless sea offered no hope of rescue. Yet amid the misery, small moments of humanity bloomed. When storms lashed the ship, Aine whispered prayers that calmed not only Bridget but others too. When one old man fell ill, she encouraged him to drink water slowly, reminding him of herbs from home even though they had none. Here just the thought steadied him. And when silence grew unbearable, she hummed songs from her childhood, soft and steady, carrying echoes of Ireland into the vast ocean night. The Vikings might not have understood the words, but even they sometimes paused, hearing something in the melody that stirred deep in their memory. Ain noticed it and understood that, even in this place of chains, the human heart could still find resonance. At last, one morning, land appeared on the horizon. Jagged coasts, dense forests, and rivers that cut into the earth like veins. The ship angled toward it with practiced ease. Nain's heart sank as she realized this was not home but another world entirely. Her journey into slavery was only beginning. Yet as fear pressed upon her, she reminded herself of the vow she had made when she saw the raven on the first night. She would not let her story end in despair. She whispered once more, not just to Bridget this time, but to every captive who listened, we are still alive. As long as we breathe, our story is not over. The ship cut into the river mouth, the oars dipping in perfect rhythm. The trees loomed close, their shadows swallowing the captives into a land unknown. And as the raven's cry echoed faintly overhead, Ain lifted her chin. She could not know the trials ahead, but she would face them. Chains could bind her wrists, but they could never silence her spirit. Market of Shadows, when the long ship finally reached its destination. Ain felt as though days had melted into weeks, and weeks into years. Though in truth the voyage had lasted only a short stretch compared to the endless distance it carved through her heart. The vessel slid up a riverbank, where wooden docks jutted out into the water like skeletal arms. Around them, the signs of settlement emerged: long houses with steep thatched roofs, smoke curling from fires, animals penned along the edges of the village. Yet for Ain and the captives, this land was no new beginning. It was the threshold of another prison, a place where they would be turned from human beings into objects of trade. The Vikings disembarked with the same energy and laughter they had displayed while raiding Ain's home. But now their eyes gleamed with another kind of hunger profit. Each captive was herded off the ship, stumbling as the solid ground felt foreign beneath their weakened legs. Ropes connected some of them together, their wrists raw and bleeding from the constant friction. Bridget clung tightly to Ain's side, her small hand trembling. Ain whispered to her not to let go, to hold fast, as though their bond could create even the smallest anchor in this storm. They were marched through the settlement until they came to an open space where people had already gathered. It was not a marketplace filled with cloth or grain or fish. It was a marketplace of flesh. Wooden posts stood at intervals, some already bearing shackles, while groups of traders haggled with the warriors who had returned from the sea. Ain felt her stomach churn as she realized what was about to happen. She and every captive around her were not simply prisoners. They were merchandise. The air here was thick with noise, the bartering voices of men discussing price, the crackle of fires, the bleating of livestock, the wails of children pulled from their mothers' arms. The smell of sweat, smoke, and unwashed bodies clung to everything. For Ain, it was like stepping into a nightmare. She had known fear in the raid, despair on the ship, but here she encountered humiliation, a stripping away of dignity that cut deeper than chains. One by one, captives were dragged forward to stand before potential buyers. Men inspected them as though they were horses or cattle. They looked at their teeth, pressed at their arms to measure strength, forced them to turn so their bodies could be judged. Sometimes a price was agreed upon, and the captive was taken away by a new master. Sometimes the buyer shook his head, declaring the person too weak, too young, or too old, and the captive was shoved back into the waiting group. When Ain's turn came, she felt her knees threaten to buckle. Rough hands shoved her forward, pulling her rope until she stood in the open. She tried to steady her breath, forcing her back straight despite the shame of being displayed. Eyes roamed over her as men spoke in the harsh language of the Norse. She could not understand the words, but she understood their meaning. She was being weighed, measured, priced. Her heart thundered, but she did not lower her gaze. Instead, she fixed her eyes on a point in the distance, where a raven perched on a wooden post. Its feathers gleamed black in the fading light, its head tilting as though it watched only her. Ain drew strength from it, reminding herself of the vow she had whispered on the ship. They could chain her wrists, they could sell her body, but they would not own her soul. One man stepped closer, inspecting her more carefully. His face was older than most of the warriors, his beard streaked with gray. He barked a question at the Viking who held her rope. Coins clinked in his hand, and for a moment Ain felt the sickening weight of being exchanged like a sack of grain. But then the old man hesitated. He looked directly into her eyes, and for a moment his expression shifted. Perhaps it was surprise at her defiance, perhaps annoyance that she did not cower like the others. Whatever it was, he stepped back, muttering, and another man took interest instead. By the end of the day, Ain had not been sold. Neither had Brigid. They were pushed aside with others deemed too young or too valuable for immediate sale, reserved instead for transport to a larger market farther inland. Relief flickered in Ain's chest, though it was twisted with dread. This meant their journey into darkness was not over, only delayed. That night, they were kept in a pen near the market square, guarded by warriors whose laughter carried easily through the night air. Ain sat with Brigid, pressed close against her, whispering stories once again to keep the child calm. Around her, others listened silently, clinging to her words as they had on the ship. She spoke not only to comfort them, but to remind herself that as long as she could speak, as long as she could tell a story, she was not truly broken. And yet, when silence returned and the captives drifted into uneasy sleep, Ain allowed herself a moment to cry. Tears slid down her cheeks, hot and silent, carrying away the weight she could not show in front of the others. She thought of her father, of her mother's hands covered in flour, of her brother's laughter, now forever gone. For a moment, she wanted to let despair take her. But then she remembered the raven on the post, the way it had stared, as though reminding her that sagas were not written in times of ease, but in times of fire. In that moment, Ain made a new vow. She would survive this not only for herself, not only for Brigid, but for every captive who no longer had the strength to hope. If they could not lift their heads, she would lift hers. If they could not speak, she would speak for them. If they could not endure, she would endure enough to carry their stories forward. The next morning, chains rattled once more as the captives were prepared for travel inland. The road ahead was unknown, the fate waiting at its end even darker. But as Ain stepped forward, her wrists bound and her heart heavy, she whispered softly to Brigid, "We are still alive. Remember that. We are still alive." And though the market had treated her as an object, though her name had nearly been erased by the clatter of coins, she walked with the unshaken knowledge that she remained a human being, and that truth was a fire no one could extinguish. House of the Northmen. The journey inland felt like walking deeper into the belly of some vast beast. The captives, bound by ropes and chains, trudged along muddy roads carved by centuries of footsteps and wagon wheels. On either side of the path rose forests dark and thick, their trees like walls pressing in, the air filled with the calls of unseen birds. For Ain, the sound of leaves rustling in the wind reminded her of home, but now that memory cut like a blade. Home was gone, and all that remained was this march toward an uncertain fate. Brigid walked beside her. Smaller steps, struggling to match the pace of the chain line. Several times the girl stumbled, and each time Ain bent slightly, whispering encouragement, lifting her back onto her feet with the quiet strength of a sister rather than a fellow captive. Ain knew that if Brigid fell too many times, the guards would see her as useless, and she feared what that judgment might bring. So Ain carried not only her own spirit, but Brigid's as well, whispering over and over the words she had made into their anchor, "We are still alive." After days of travel, they reached a settlement larger than the riverside village where they had first been brought. Here stood long houses that towered like wooden fortresses, their roofs adorned with carved dragon heads. Smoke poured from chimneys, the smell of roasted meat drifting across the air. People bustled about, men sharpening tools, women carrying baskets, children chasing dogs. To the Norse, this was home, a place of family and livelihood. To the captives, it was a place of judgment, where their fates would be decided. Aine and several others, including Brigid, were pulled aside and led to one of the larger houses at the center of the settlement. Its doorframe was carved with intricate runes, and its walls gleamed with the marks of wealth. This, Aine realized, was not a house for ordinary men. This was the home of a chieftain or a man of power. Inside, the air was warm from a great fire burning in the hearth. The walls lined with shields, weapons, and trophies from past raids. Here, Aine's new life began. She was handed over to the household of a Northman whose name she could not pronounce. A man with a heavy beard and the commanding presence of someone used to obedience. He did not see her as a girl stolen from her home, but as property, a slave to serve his hall. Her wrists were finally unbound, but the freedom was a cruel illusion. Invisible chains of fear and power bound her more tightly than any rope. Her days in the house of the Northman followed a rhythm of labor. She cleaned, carried water, prepared food, and tended to the livestock. The work was relentless, and any mistake drew sharp rebukes. At night, she collapsed onto the straw that served as her bed, her body aching. Yet even here, Aine clung to the ember of defiance within her. She did not allow herself to grow numb. She remembered who she was, whispered her name in the dark so it would not be forgotten, and spoke softly to Brigid, who worked alongside her in smaller tasks. Together they wove threads of humanity into a world that tried to strip them of it. What surprised Aine most was how the household around her lived. The Norse women of the hall commanded authority within its walls, overseeing the work of others with voices sharp as blades. Children played at her feet, laughing freely, their innocence at odds with the cruelty that had stolen Aine's own childhood. And among the warriors, she saw glimpses of weariness, of tenderness when they embraced their kin after returning from long journeys. It was strange and bitter to see that those who had brought destruction to her life were also fathers, mothers, children. Monsters in one place, ordinary in another. Aine's spirit endured because she chose to see what others ignored. She noticed when an elderly slave coughed through the night and shared what little water she could. She offered quiet words of comfort to a boy who wept after being beaten for dropping a jug. In small acts, she created a defiance the Northmen could not extinguish. Her captors might believe they had reduced her to property, but in truth she was building something invisible: respect, connection, and the resilience of community among the enslaved. One winter evening, as snow fell thick outside and the hall filled with the noise of feasting, Aine stood silently in the shadows, pouring mead into wooden cups. The warriors laughed, their voices rising with the heat of fire and drink. A skald sang a saga of heroes long dead, his voice echoing through the rafters. Aine listened, though she did not understand all the words, and realized something profound. These men sang of courage, of endurance in the face of hardship, of warriors who would rather die than surrender. And yet, they could not see that same spirit burning in the captives at their feet. They celebrated resilience in their songs, but ignored it in the lives they crushed. That night, when the feast ended and silence returned, Aine whispered to Brigid, "They do not see it, but we are warriors too. Every day we endure, we fight a battle they cannot understand. And one day, our endurance will outlast their cruelty." Her words were seeds planted in the darkness, invisible yet alive. And as Brigid's eyes lit with the faintest spark of hope, Anne felt the truth settle in her own bones. She was not just surviving. She was becoming a story, a saga, not of conquest, but of courage. A raven overhead the winter in the north was unlike anything Aine had ever known. In Ireland, winters had been sharp, with winds that rattled the doors of their huts and rain that fell endlessly from gray skies. But there had still been green fields waiting beneath the frost. Here in the land of the Northmen, winter came like a beast that swallowed the world whole. The rivers froze solid, the trees stood stripped and skeletal, and the sun itself seemed to retreat, offering only pale light for a few brief hours each day. For Aine, who labored from dawn until the deep hours of night, it was as though she lived in eternal shadow. The hall of the chieftain was always warm, its central fire blazing, yet that warmth did not belong to her. It belonged to the warriors and their kin, who sat close to the flames, eating and drinking while the slaves served them. Ain and Brigid worked constantly, moving silently through the hall like shadows. They learned to anticipate every command, to avoid the sharp bark of anger from those they served. And yet, within this life of subjugation, Ain's resolve only grew sharper. She told herself again and again, survival was not enough. She must hold on to her humanity, her voice, her spirit. Even if it was only in whispers at night when the hall finally slept. One evening, a storm raged outside, the kind that made even the Northmen frown as the wind howled like wolves at the doors. Ain had been ordered to help carry water for the hearth when she heard a sound from the corner of the hall. A child's cough, sharp and persistent. She turned her head and saw a small boy, the chieftain's youngest son, curled on a bench, his face pale and his breath shallow. The boy's mother, a stern woman who usually carried herself with authority, heard anxiously, her eyes betraying fear that her son's strength was failing. The hall was loud with laughter and drinking. But Ain's ears locked onto the sound of that cough, relentless and weakening. Without thinking, Ain remembered herbs her mother had once used back in Ireland. She knew which plants soothed the chest, which eased the breath. But here in this foreign land, she had no herbs, no remedies, nothing but the knowledge lodged deep in her memory. She hesitated, her hands trembling, for to speak out of turn was dangerous. A slave who presumed too much could earn punishment. Yet she could not watch the child suffer while remaining silent. Her heart, shaped by kindness even in chains, pushed her forward. Quietly, hush. She approached the woman, bowing her head in respect. In broken words, mixing her tongue with what little Norse she had learned, Ain tried to explain. She pointed to the boy, then mimed crushing herbs and boiling water. Her voice was low, hesitant, but her eyes were steady. The woman frowned, uncertain whether to dismiss her or to consider her words. For a long moment, Ain thought she had gone too far. But then the woman gestured sharply. Another servant was sent running to fetch what herbs they could find. That night, Ain worked carefully, brewing a mixture as her mother had taught her. The hall grew quiet, warriors watching curiously as the slave girl tended to the chieftain's son. She held the cup to the boy's lips, whispering softly, urging him to drink. Hours passed, the storm outside unrelenting, until finally the boy's cough began to ease, his breathing steadying. Relief washed across the mother's face, and even the chieftain, who had returned from drinking with his men, stared at Ain with something between suspicion and respect. The next morning, the boy was stronger. His laughter returned, thin but real, and his mother's eyes found awe, with a gaze that was no longer filled with indifference. For the first time since she had been dragged from her home, Ain felt the weight of her chains shift, if only slightly. She was still a slave, still bound to this hall. But her humanity had pierced the armor of those who saw her only as property. Her act of kindness had changed something. Even if she could not yet name it, word spread quietly among the other slaves, who looked at her with a new kind of reverence. They whispered that Ain had done what none of them dared, that she had faced the risk of punishment to save a life. In their eyes, she was more than just another captive. She was proof that even in chains, one could hold power. Not the power of the sword or the coin, but the power of compassion. The strength to act when fear told you to remain silent. One evening, as Ain stepped outside to draw water from the frozen well, she looked up and saw a raven circling above the hall, its black wings cutting through the pale winter sky. It cawed once, sharp and echoing, before vanishing into the forest. She stood still, breath visible in the icy air, and felt a strange certainty. The raven was watching her, guiding her, reminding her that her story was not one of despair but of endurance. It was not just a bird. It was a sign, a messenger of resilience. She returned inside with her shoulders straighter, her spirit stronger. She whispered to Brigid later that night, "They believe chains make us powerless. But true power is not in chains or swords. It is in the choices we make. Even here we can choose kindness. Even here we can choose courage." Brigid, who had once been hollow-eyed with grief, now nodded with a flicker of light in her gaze. "Then we will choose," she said softly. And so, Aen's defiance grew not loud, not violent, but steady and quiet. Woven through every act of care, every word of comfort, every refusal to let despair win. She was no longer simply surviving. She was shaping a legacy, one that could not yet be seen, but that would echo like the wings of the raven across generations, beyond the chain spring. Returned slowly to the land of the north, as though the earth itself had to struggle free of the winter's icy grip. The snow melted, rivers swelled with rushing water, and green shoots of life forced their way up through frozen ground. For the Norse, this season meant new voyages, fresh raids, and renewed wealth. For Aen, it meant the continuation of her bondage. Yet something had shifted in her heart and in the eyes of those around her. She was still a slave, but no longer invisible. The memory of how she had saved the chieftain's son lingered in the hall, altering the way some looked at her. The Northman's wife, who had once regarded Aen only as a tool, now watched her with reluctant respect. The boy she had healed often ran to her, clinging to her skirts as though she were kin. Even the chieftain himself no longer dismissed her entirely. When he looked at her, there was something grudging in his gaze, as though he sensed a strength he could not break. But for Aen, none of this changed her inner truth. She was not free. And freedom was what her soul still... "One day," she said softly, "we will not be slaves. One day, we will be remembered not for our chains, but for our endurance." Brigid, whose spirit had once seemed crushed, now nodded with eyes brighter than before. She had begun to grow into her own strength, her childhood scarred but not destroyed. Together they clung to hope, building it like a secret fire in the shadows. One morning, they worked in the fields outside the hall. Aen heard a commotion near the gates. Strangers had arrived, traders from across distant seas, speaking in tongues both familiar and foreign. They had come not only for goods, but also for people, for the Norse traded captives as eagerly as silver or furs. For a terrible moment, Aen feared that she and Brigid might be sold again, cast into an even darker fate. But instead, she overheard whispers. The chieftain would keep them. Not out of compassion, but because they were now too valuable, too useful. In a world where lives were measured in coin, survival itself became a strange kind of victory that night. Aen stepped outside the hall, the cool spring wind brushing against her face. She tilted her head back, staring at the stars that stretched endlessly above. How many others, she wondered, were looking at the same sky? How many captives across distant lands whispered prayers into the darkness, hoping their voices might be heard? She closed her eyes, letting the thought expand in her chest. She was not alone. None of them were. Their suffering was vast, but so too was their endurance, as weeks turned into months. Aen's quiet acts of defiance continued. She comforted the broken, shared what little she had, and taught Brigid the songs of their homeland so that Ireland would not be forgotten. She carved small symbols into the wood near her sleeping place marks that only she and the others understood. Reminders that they still existed as more than property. Each act was small, almost invisible, yet together they formed a chain of their own. Not a chain of iron, but of memory, of resilience, of humanity unbroken. One evening, during a feast, a skald sang a